You're listening to the VBMA podcast.
The AVMA is your association. Whether you're looking for professional resources or no-cost insurance options for SABMA members, the AVMA family of AVMA and AVMA Trust have your back. For the past 20 years, Nationwide has been honored to stand as a founding sponsor of the VBMA. Our goal is to help provide relevant educational content to empower aspiring veterinarians to take a holistic approach to pet health care and meet pet families where they are.
Simmons Educational Fund, a proud sponsor of VBMA, exists to support the veterinary profession through business education. Each year, veterinary students are invited to apply for the SEF Business Aptitude Award, one of the largest awards of its kind. To learn more about SEF, visit SimmonsEdFund.org. That's SimmonsEdFund.org.
Welcome, everybody, to another exciting episode of our podcast. Today, I'm so excited to have two very special guests on. First up is Cindy Courtney, veterinarian and founder of The Jerk Researcher, alongside Josh Vaisman, founder and owner of Flourish Veterinary Consulting.
Hello, it's so great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, this is delightful. Really excited for today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. And I know you guys know, but for our listeners, our topic today is going to be working through crisis, which is very broad, has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people. And so to kick it off, why don't we just go ahead and define exactly in what terms we're talking about crisis in today?
Yeah. And I think that there definitely, when we heard that this was a topic that membership was really interested in hearing about, we definitely recognize that there are some types of crisis that we are prepared to talk with you guys about, and some not so much. And also, of course, some outside of the scope of what we generally talk about in the VBMA, right? So as a clinician, of course, there are those medical crises that we're dealing with our patients. So I think that's outside of the scope of what we're going to talk about today. And then neither of us here are mental health counselors. Like, neither of us are clinical mental health professionals. And so we just wanted to make sure that, of course, in a lot of crises, mental health becomes a big issue. And we wanted to make sure to talk with you all about the fact that there are those that you should, and there are those that you should reach out to when you find yourself in that position. I know personally, I have definitely found myself in times of crisis where I've had to handle the business side of things. But first, I've had to handle the mental health side of things first. I know on a personal level, I moved halfway across the country. I'd been practicing in Virginia, moved my family to the Kansas City area, was doing a clinical practice job that was supposed to be a slow full-time practice, while I was also doing non-clinical work on the side. They said, "Oh, we want you to take on this new role, but we won't give you that role until you have less work on your plate." And both of those roles ended up being way more than I could handle. And I thought if I told either group that it was more than I could handle, that I was going to end up with no jobs. And I had just moved halfway across the country. And I thought if I, drop this job, I'm going to kind of get blacklisted here in the area. I'm going to have a hard time finding another job. And I've just made this huge bet, and I felt very, very stuck, felt very overwhelmed most of the time. I didn't want to be a burden on the people in my life, and my brain kept telling me that I shouldn't be complaining, I shouldn't be venting. And so I didn't reach out for that help and those tools that I really needed in the moment I needed them most. And I really was having a lot of suicidal ideation at that time, feeling very, very, very stuck. And so I did finally have a friend who kind of jolted me and got me to think about it being more important to stay alive than to stay in that situation. And when I did finally start reaching out to folks, they actually were extremely helpful. And the situation has really worked out beautifully and worked out wonderfully. So again, just want to make sure that folks know, if you do find yourself in crisis, you find yourself feeling trapped, and you feel very, very stuck, and you can't get out of that cycle, the very first most important thing you can do is start reaching out. And again, we're going to talk about the resources that you can use. The easiest one, I think, of course, is the new 988 suicide helpline that is now available to get you in contact with some folks that might be able to help. Josh, other resources that come to mind for you on that one?
Yeah. First of all, Cindy, thank you for sharing that very personal and vulnerable story. I think that's really meaningful, and it means a lot to me personally that you're comfortable sharing that. I think that can be really helpful for people to hear, that even those of us who seem wholly put together sometimes have struggles that can turn into an individual and personal crisis that requires help beyond what you and I can offer in this podcast. So I'm grateful that you're still here with us today. I'm really grateful for that friend that gave you the jolt that you needed. One thing that I always like to add when I talk about resources like the suicide helpline, that 988 number, while the term suicide is clearly in the phrasing around what it is called, it is not just for somebody who might be struggling with suicidal ideation. If you're in any way, shape, or form struggling with some kind of a mental health crisis, and you just need to talk to somebody who can help you or refer you to somebody who can help you, the people who are, the trained crisis counselors on those hotlines are very valuable, even if you're, quote, not having suicidal ideation. So I think, yes, I think that's an excellent resource. A few other resources that I'll sometimes talk about, the Emotional PPE Project is a really nice resource. Also, the Veterinary Hope Foundation, although that's not really for crisis per se, that's more for community building and building hope. Any one of those organizations are going to be helpful if you're really in that acute state of crisis.
Yeah. And I also want to just let folks know that there are so many folks that I know have kind of been through that journey and come out the other side and are there and are eager to kind of reach back and help people get to that other side as well. And again, just that remembering that the other side can seem so far away, and each little step forward can feel so daunting. But there is another side on the other side of that, and those crisis counselors can often help you get there.
Yep.
At least know what the next step forward is. So I think what is within our scope today is to kind of talk, especially within the business case, what happens when we're facing the various kind of business crises, especially in the sense of, okay, something has happened suddenly, like you were not expecting this to happen, and it has some pretty big impacts on you and the organization that you have to respond to very quickly. Does that fit with what you're thinking, Josh, and maybe some examples?
Yeah, definitely. I think that absolutely fits. So, some examples that we talked about before we got started, the three of us were, I think Jasmine, it might have even been you that mentioned this idea of, you're coming into your hospital every day. You're an associate veterinarian, you're a credentialed technician, whatever it might be. And you've been working in this practice that you love for years and years with the team of people that you just adore. And it's a privately owned practice. And maybe you even take a lot of pride in that this is, a mom and pop shop here in the community. And one day mom and pop show up and they tell you, oh, by the way, yesterday we signed an agreement to sell the hospital to the latest corporate group. A totally unexpected change in your world. That can feel like a bit of a crisis, maybe a crisis of identity, a crisis of uncertainty, those kinds of things. I can think of examples even with our own organization that at Flourish that we went through just a couple of years ago, where we had gotten heavily involved with an industry partner to the point of almost half of our annual revenue came from this one partner who, unceremoniously announced to us at the end of one year that they had vastly underperformed their budget, and they were entirely slashing the program that we were a part of. And so as a company, that could feel like a big crisis with we were a 4-year-old company at the time. We had just added team members, that can feel like a crisis, those kinds of situations. I think those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking of that we can definitely start to address today. Cindy, what do you think?
Yeah. And especially as a conflict research, conflicts come to mind, top of mind for me, of course.
Yeah.
So I think about things like, okay, you had that not only a negative review, maybe from a client, which I think all of us will deal with at some point, but maybe it even escalated, where now it's escalated to what cyberbullying or cyber mobbing, where now we have people kind of flooding your page with negative reviews that maybe they're not even clients, and you're very concerned about what that's going to do with your goodwill in the community. It has a big personal impact. I also think about things like, hey, what happens if the team has decided that this practice culture is toxic and they're deciding that they're leaving and they're leaving in droves, and now you don't have enough team members to kind of maintain the level of care that you want to maintain for your practices. You've had 3 team members go on to give their notice within a 1-week period, or, less negatively, like more positive news, right? You have 3 team members who all announce that they're going on maternity leave. In the same period of time, right? So there are definitely times where we have to flex very quickly. And fortunately, I think being a VBMA member, especially in the ways that becoming a VBMA officer, you're kind of running your chapter like its own small business. I think it can give you some opportunities to practice. Like, okay, this thing happened. Now, what are we going to do about it? I remember when I was on the National Leadership Board, we had some changes around sponsorship and what was and wasn't allowed at different chapters. And it was really exciting to see some of the VBMA chapters adapting to some of those crises within their organization and how things had operated in the past. So I think the question is, what is the first thing that we do when you find out the crisis is here?
I think on some level it kind of depends. I want to ask you a question, Cindy, if that's okay. I'm listening to the descriptions that you're giving, some of the examples that you've given, and it seems to me that in terms of what you earlier, you referred to these as like business crises. There's at least 2 factors or 2 variables that maybe define a business crisis. Number one, the unexpected, that something happened that was sort of unexpected or out of our control. And number 2, that unexpected circumstance is now requiring a shift from us. Do you think that's a fair way to describe it?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I think for me, I'm sort of thinking about these in the context of like a veterinary organization or veterinary team, that there's kind of 2 sides to this, right? There's the group side. There's the, you're the practice manager, and consecutively, associate veterinarian technician walk into your office and say, hey, by the way, I'm pregnant and I'm going on maternity leave. 3 in a row, right? Yeah. That affects the whole hospital. You have a bad experience with a client, and that client goes and starts a Facebook group about how horrible your practice is. And before you know it, there's 15,000 people in the group, and they're all actively bashing your hospital. That affects the whole hospital, right?
Right.
There's also the individual side of like you as the practice manager that now have to deal with, oh my God, I just lost 20% of my staff to maternity leave. Or you as the owner or the associate veterinarian that's being targeted, or, the close friend on the team that has that, like, there's that individual impact. I see you nodding. You're putting your hand up.
Yeah,
you have something to add to this.
I think that's a great way to think about it. I think there's another thing that, as you're mentioning, that comes up for me as well is, we're talking about these things as unexpected, and in large part they are, but we also know that we're giving examples that are relatively common in veterinary medicine. And we also know that in medicine, the unexpected happens, right? So it also makes me think about response, which I think is primarily there is also an element of prevention here, right? Or resilience, building resilience within the organization. And I think we'll probably allude to that. I'm not sure how much we'll have time to dive into that piece of it, but how prepared is that organization to respond to these unexpected events, or how much have they thought ahead about what we can do when the unexpected happens? So I love both thinking about the group impact, the individual impact, as well as this response piece, as well as the prevention piece.
Okay, so
those moving parts.
I'm going to mess this up. I'm hoping, because Cindy as the jerk researcher is,
Yeah.
and I mean this in the kindest way possible because I have a great deal of admiration, a super nerd. So I'm hoping that Cindy will actually help me with my recall here because I am struggling. Recently, there was a book published by two amazing academics, one of whom is the dean at Wharton, maybe, where they basically, they're making the argument from an evidence base that there's the 3 P's of business we always talk about: people, purpose, and profits, that we actually need to have a fourth one, which is preparedness. And that's what they're talking about, that, we're so reactive to crises. Cindy, what you just said is like, it's such a wonderful thing that I hadn't even thought about until you said it. And I do this as well for a living. Like we often sort of go through life, probably not consciously or overtly assuming, but we're functioning as if we assume that, sure, crises like these happen, but they happen to others.
Exactly.
And then when it hits us, we act as if it's like this brand new thing, when the reality is they're kind of common. And so if we can put some effort into some preparation for when the inevitable crisis, we may not know exactly what the crisis itself is that's going to hit us, but we can prepare for sort of generally crises in a way that can help us actually be a lot more resilient when they do come.
Yeah. And I'm going to let Josh down because I am a huge book nerd and that one hasn't crossed my plate yet, but I bet we can find it and put it in the show notes for everyone. But yeah, and I think for me, that comes from this idea of people so often when it comes to conflict think, if I'm good enough, I'm not going to have conflict. If I'm good enough, that's something we're not going to have to deal with. And so I deal with kind of this opposite problem, which is people think if they prepare enough, they'll never have to respond. And I think you have to be ready with both, right? Because we can never have 100% preparation. We're always going to have need to have some response skills. But you don't have to respond as often if you do have good preparation.
I found it, by the way. It's The Prepared Leader by Erica James and Lynn Perry Wooten from the Wharton Business School. I'm pretty sure, I can't remember which one, but I'm pretty sure that one of them is actually the dean there. But that's the book that argument is based from.
Fantastic.
And yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think that preparedness is essential, but that doesn't mean that you're going to prevent every potential crisis, nor are you just going to we're still emotionally reactive creatures. Crises are still going to be hard.
But I think you can, as an organization, prepare to respond.
Yes.
And so, like, for instance, a lot of times I'll go in and talk to teams about conflict and being prepared for what are we going to do when someone does raise a concern. My very good friend, Caitlin DeWild, she talks to teams about, do they have a cyberbullying response plan? Do they know what to do if and when that happens? I think about things on that individual level, Josh. Do we have a self-care plan for when we are dealing with a crisis? One of the most important lessons I think I learned from a medical and a personal perspective was when I was first in practice, my first couple months, I literally had multiple emergencies in general practice that I was juggling at the same time 2 weeks in a row. And I won't go into the details of why that was. That was partly on me. My practice had set me up for success. But I had a great technician with me who had worked in ER, and she said, the patient is not going to die if you take 1 second to breathe. Right? And so I think the very first thing we have to do in crisis is remember to do the breath step. Okay, don't panic. Like, we know this thing is here. Can we gather ourselves? Can we make sure that we're okay, that we're not stuck in our amygdala? We're not so flooded that we're responding from a place of reactivity so that we can respond in a way that makes sense for us and for our organization. And so understanding what that looks like for you, whether that's you're going to go home and talk with your people and you're going to get some empathy and you're going to vent, you're going to get a nap, you're going to do your run. What does that mean for your organization? Does that mean that you're going to give them empathy? And I'm going to toss that piece over to Josh, because with his positive psychology background and focus on psychological safety, I think that's where some of your expertise really shines, Josh, is how can that team be prepared to kind of face that moment and kind of take a breath as a group?
Yeah. Okay, so I want to reflect. I'm going to answer that,
Yeah.
but I want to reflect something that I think I heard you say, which you feel like an essential, if not the first step, an early step to handling crisis is some sort of a grounding activity.
Yeah. I strongly believe that, because I think if you just react from instinct or you react from a place of high emotionality,
Mm-hmm.
I think we are sometimes likely to react from a place of fear, and it's going to be defensive. And what we tend to find is from defensiveness, stonewalling, criticism, those places that tend to show up more when we're kind of feeling flooded in our emotions, those things tend to escalate conflict instead of resolving it. So I worry that if we don't do that grounding exercise first, we're likely to make a crisis worse instead of to resolve it.
I totally agree. I'll often talk to folks about how, like it is a completely normal, natural, and highly beneficial psychological, psychoneurological, physiological response to get into that very hot fight or flight kind of state in the face of crisis. And that's good. I mean, as a species, it's good that we have that reaction. It kept us alive for millennia. And when you're standing in an exam room and you've got a really upset client in front of you, it turns out that, throat punching or running out of the room screaming, not productive responses. So we need to have a way to recenter, right? To ground ourselves and get a little bit away from those hot emotions into a more rational state. So, yeah, I love that grounding activity. And then in terms of empathy, I think you're spot on, Cindy. I think that having some sort of a plan for an empathetic response, both self-compassion, that sort of self-empathy, yes, definitely don't throat punch the clients, agreed, that self-empathy, but also offering empathy to others. So, often what I'm most focused on in the work that I do at Flourish is on the leadership side of things, and I'm often guiding leaders around this. There is the reality of the human construct, the way that we're built. We are emotional creatures. Like any way you cut it, even the most stoic among us, even the people that are like, no, we don't show emotions. We're emotional creatures who have an unbelievably powerful brain that has the ability to rationalize our emotional decisions. That's really who we are. So when we're in that emotional state, our tendency is to react to whatever emotion we're feeling. Now, I think that over our life, we grow some level of emotional maturity. Some of us maybe different levels of it than others, but generally speaking, we get to some extent of maturity where we can self-regulate and control some of those responses, maybe dependent on the social norms or dependent on our goals or the demands upon us or what we're aspiring towards, whatever it might be. But the reality is when we have something that's wholly unexpected and shakes our world, which is kind of how we define crisis, our first physiological response is driven by emotion. We also know that there's an incredible power in verbalizing, in naming how we're feeling, and actually stating what we're going through. And I worry sometimes that a leader in the face of an unexpected crisis is a redundancy. I'm going to make redundant statements now. It's the Department of, what is it from Monty Python? There's something about the Department of Redundancy in a Monty Python squid. Anyway, I worry that sometimes a leader's response in the face of crisis is, I have to hold things together. And so they repress their own emotional state and then inadvertently or unintentionally attempt to repress the emotional state of the people around them, which feels highly dismissive. It feels like out of touch. People, when we tell people, you're not allowed to feel what you're feeling right now, the feelings just get stronger. And it creates a gap. It creates reactance. It's not helpful. So I think that one of the best things that we can do in the face of that is give it the space that it needs to breathe. Let it open up for a little bit, And there are ways that we can put guardrails around that and so on and so forth. One of the most simple ones is to just own it. I worked with a medical director once, and she, after many coaching sessions, she finally came to the decision that she was going to go back to her team and say, you know what? this kind of does suck what we're going through right now. Corporate's putting a lot of demands on us. We don't have enough people. We've been trying to hire for months. We haven't found anyone. It seems like the client demands way exceed our capacity to meet them. This sucks. And she did that. The next day, she went to the practice, and at their morning huddle, that is what she said to the team. And it changed the entire dynamic. Just like her standing in front of them being like, you're right, this sucks. And not giving up, not being like, okay, let's just ruminate in the suckiness. Let's own it. Let's talk about how it sucks and how it's impacting us. And then let's talk about what we can do despite the suck, right? So that was one way. Another one that I came across recently that I really loved. I wish I could remember the practice. This hospital, they came up with a policy. Cindy, I think you'll get a kick out of this. They bought little emotion wheel keychains for everybody in the practice. And then the agreement was, this is one of the things that you were talking about with the preparedness, like having a plan for when it happens. Instead of trying to react to it, being prepared for it. The way that they used it was like, listen, we're going to have interactions that are going to be kind of shitty. We're going to have clients that they're going to rail at us for irrational reasons. It's going to seem like it's out of left field. We're going to have some difficult communications here in the practice, so on and so forth. The rule in our hospital that we've all agreed to, we've all talked about it, we're all going to buy into this, is that if you see Jasmine get off a phone call and she looks pretty flustered because she's had a pretty horrible interaction with somebody, you just pull her aside, you hand her your emotion wheel, and you ask her, Jasmine, just tell me what you're feeling right now. Now, the reason behind that is because we know pretty conclusively really, really cool neuroscience research. Like, we're not talking like just like foo-foo shit. We're talking about putting people in an fMRI machine and looking at what happens in their amygdala in real time and just having them name an emotional experience that they're feeling. Almost instantaneous reduction in amygdala response. Like that, it literally helps us get back into executive function. So if we can give people the space to just, hey, let's talk a little bit about what you're experiencing right now. You don't have to sit there forever, but you have to sit there for a bit. I think that can be a really helpful response too.
Yeah. And I think, at least my understanding of the research as well, is that empathy is another way of us giving verbalization to some of those emotions. And we don't always get it right the first time, but when we do, you see that like relaxation in somebody's body and that relief that they feel understood.
Yes.
And so if we can get our brain to that place where we're not in crisis mode, where we're not flighted, we're not stuck in kind of that reactivity, then I think we can get to a better place. The other thing that I think is way, way, way underutilized, and I'm an evangelist for need list. So I think we're starting to get to a place where we talk about emotions more and emotional literacy and knowing what emotions we're feeling and being okay with having felt emotions. I also like to remind people that generally speaking, the emotions we're feeling are connected to underlying needs. So the fact that like, hey, I'm feeling really angry because I want some degree of certainty in what's happening with my practice. And I don't want this change to be coming. I might not be able to get that certainty, but I am entitled to feel a certain way. Like that need is not an irrational need. It's not like an alien need. It's a very human need to have. And so even just being able to take that feeling and connect it to a need or a value or a desire can both be calming, I think, internally to validate ourselves. But I also find it incredibly useful to moving into the next step of the crisis, which is like, okay, well, what do we want to do? Mm-hmm. Because often the crisis is going to have some boundaries on it around things that we can and cannot do, right? Like, so while this depends a little bit on the laws, and again, lawyers are another great resource to turn to in times of crisis, but depending on the laws of the state, say you have that cyberbullying client, right, who might be saying things that are completely untrue in these online reviews, right? You may be limited in the amount of things that you can say back to them and the amount of details that you can share about that case. So we may have some boundaries. So we might have a need for fairness and truth and justice, and we might not be able to completely satisfy that need, but we can figure out, well, what is it that I can do? Even if I can't go back and blast all of the truth of this client's medical record on this online review, maybe there is a legal way that we can ask for a cease and desist letter for this client. Or maybe I can go on the AVMA cyberbullying resource and I can ask them, what are some of the fair responses that we can take to this? So when we understand that we have this feeling and we acknowledge it, then we can move to the need. And when we know the need, then we can often move to, okay, well, what are the variety of solutions that we might have for getting those needs met? I think the other thing that's important to remember about needs is just because somebody is upset doesn't mean they have the same needs. So I think Josh alluded to the fact that some people might have a really strong identity tied to like the freedom and independence of being part of a private practice. Their frustration around a change in ownership might be really different than somebody who's frustrated because they just wanted everything to stay the same. And so navigating kind of these different needs that people have can be really helpful to kind of air out like, hey, what are people concerned about? I do think having boundaries can be helpful because I think you can end up with Event Fest and you can say like, okay, here's what we are going to do. Here's what we're not going to do. So we're not going to be name calling. We're not going to be cursing. If we start feeling flooded, let's take a break. Like we're going to be trying to talk about, like what we're feeling, what we're needing, and what solutions might be. So I think we can put some boundaries around that discussion so that we're not necessarily creating a bigger crisis by then having everybody gearing each other up and winding each other up even more. But we're kind of, again, empathizing with those emotions, moving through them and getting to some more solutions.
Emotional dismissal in the face of a crisis is never productive, but co-rumination is also not very helpful either, because that can feel just as stuck as the crisis makes you feel. So you want to have, I love that idea of having, I was hearing in my head as you were talking, Cindy, rules of engagement. We are in the face of this situation right now. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to sit here together for this period of time, and we're going to talk about how it's affecting you. We're going to talk about what needs you feel are threatened and what needs you would need to have met to feel less threatened or more capable moving forward. And then at the end of this, guys, we're going to talk about what moving forward looks like, because we are going to move forward together. Having those guardrails, I think, is absolutely lovely, and keeping it focused like that. I worry sometimes that folks in leadership position have a sense of urgency to move to the solutioning too quickly. But of course, you can't ignore the solutioning either. And so there's a little bit of, it's a bit of a fine dance, which I think also brings up another point. While crises are inevitable and in the community relatively common, for individuals and for groups, and especially a particular type of crisis, it may be a once in a career kind of experience. And the reality is that if we try and apply some sort of a perfectionist mindset to crisis management, we are going to be wholly disappointed. And so I think part of the preparation is also realizing what I think you were sort of alluding to earlier, Cindy, that we're not going to be perfect at this. There's going to be stumbles. There's going to be things that you're going to think back and, oh, gosh, I wish I would have done that differently. It's not about doing it 100%. It's about doing most of it well enough to get you and the group through.
Absolutely. And also, like, you may do your best, and you may even find out after the fact that you're like, well, if I had a do-over, I would have done it differently. And I also try to emphasize to people the importance of repair. So I think often when we do conflict and we mess up conflict or we mess up a crisis, we often think to ourselves like, oh my gosh, like I'm just so bad. I'm just so bad at this. I'm just not good at this. And we kind of forget, like, whether it's medically or whether it's interpersonally, like the goal is we are not going to be perfect. Like, medicine is incredibly complex. So are interpersonal relationships. There are going to be times it doesn't go perfectly. There are going to be times that we mess up. And I don't know about the other folks listening, but I was definitely in that camp of people who were like, I am just going to get it right all the time. And so I'm never going to feel ashamed. I'm never going to question my ability as a doctor because I'm just going to be such an awesome doctor. And I was in the top 10% of my vet school class. And let me tell you, folks, that does not protect you from making mistakes. So I think the big thing is to know that feeling of heaviness when you don't do it right is a sign that you care. It's not a sign that you're bad at what you're doing. And that's a sign that we want to go back and that we want to figure out like, okay, what do I want to do next time? How can I repair the situation as best I can? And then do differently going forward, right? And that often relationships can be stronger because of the repair, even if you had a conflict, right? Sometimes the relationship is even stronger because you had the conflict and then the repair than if you had never had the conflict in the first place. Because now you've shown, whether it's that client or that team member, that, hey, we can stick together through a crisis. Like we are actually, like, it's hard to build psychological safety if everything is just dandy all the time. If no one ever takes risks together, then you're not able to prove that you can trust one another, right? Because there's nothing to really trust against, right?
Yeah,
So,
I'm listening to you, Cindy. I'm thinking of things like, I love this word repair, by the way. I think that's absolutely phenomenal. That heavy feeling after a crisis that maybe didn't go as well as it could have is a golden opportunity to repair relationships and build them up actually stronger because of that. You know, there's a concept in positive psychology and resiliency research that we often refer to as post-traumatic growth. And that's what crises give us the opportunity to do. When we look at the resiliency research, we find that the people who actually display the greatest long-term resiliency are not the people who have avoided crises. They're not the people who have been the perfect doctor and everything already went well. It's the people who have faced these kinds of things. And afterwards, more often than not, they'll say things like, gosh, I wish I didn't go through that. And you know what? I probably could have done things a bit better. And I wouldn't wish that kind of experience on my enemy. If I would have avoided it, if I could have avoided it, I would have. And the fact that I went through that, gosh, look at all that I learned. And I feel so much stronger because of that. And, the next time something similar comes along, I'm going to be much more prepared. One of the ways that I think we can benefit from that is the repair approach. And another one that I think can be complementary is a bit of like a debrief afterwards. One example that I think of from human medicine is Schwartz rounds. You're nodding. I think maybe you're familiar
with them. Yes.
Yeah. So Schwartz rounds are a thing that they do like after difficult experiences in a medical setting of some kind. And they're facilitated, they're guided. The whole purpose is to really give people that opportunity to kind of express, like, this is how this thing impacted me. This is what it felt like going through it, and sort of hear all different perspectives and start to lean a little bit into what was learned because of it. It can be a really nice thing. I want to remind folks who are listening to this podcast that this is indeed actually Jasmine's podcast, and she is, in fact, still here. I just can't seem to shut up. So, Jasmine, what do you want to ask us that we haven't addressed yet?
First and foremost, you two have just a magic that, like, I didn't need to interrupt because you just work so well together and chatting with each other. And I've just been enjoying listening to this conversation so much. I really don't have much else to add.
There was one other thought that came to mind for me, if I may, Jasmine.
Yeah.
Which is kind of I think Josh and I both tend toward very collaborative approaches and mediated approaches. And I think I don't want people to leave with the idea that at the end of the day, someone's got to make a decision, right? Like, at the end of the day, there are still leaders. There is somebody who still makes the call. And so I also just want to remind folks that when we decide, there are probably going to be people who don't like the thing that we decide. And so when we talk about repair, that's part of the reason why is being able to explain, hey, this is why I made the decision that I made. I tried to make the best decision I could with the information that I had at the time. And it definitely was hard. Often you're going to have to make a decision in light of, not being able to make everybody happy. Mm-hmm. And so, being willing to make that call in the scenario, while also, I think, as Josh alluded to, triaging and being able to say, what decisions do I really have to make in the moment? Which decisions do I really have to make by myself? There will be some of those, but if you can create room to collaborate, to listen, to create a little bit of space for yourself, please make sure to take the time to do that.
Love it. Well said.
Yeah. So, and then maybe we can come back at some point and talk about prevention or crisis preparedness.
Yes.
Yeah. That is one thing I was thinking about as you were talking about preparedness, because I have done a lot of work in like natural disaster preparedness. And like I just kept relating, wow, crisis and natural disasters have a lot of similarities. And, we go through this whole incident command system through FEMA and whatnot, who gets involved when. And it still kind of relates. Like when we talk about, say, a wildfire breaks out in Larimer County. I'm at Colorado State. We live in Larimer County. Wildfires are a thing every summer. They always say you start and end the response locally. You escalate it if you need to. And I think in like a corporate structure that still really speaks volumes. Like we will always handle things at the hospital level. If it needs to escalate from there to the regional, to the national, corporate level, absolutely, that's how we'll respond.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I love about veterinary medicine is that because we can be such generalists, I feel like sometimes our brains are prepped to bring in things from all different areas and apply them to our work.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know the intricacies of natural disaster preparedness, but I would not at all be surprised if the methodologies that are used for that you apparently have some insight on, Jasmine. I would be willing to bet that if you just applied those methodologies to preparing for any kind of in-practice crisis, you could probably develop a pretty good plan.
Yeah, and that's also kind of what's interesting is that they develop these plans in a collaborative unit. Like oftentimes Larimer County will get together with Weld County and, how can we work together and how do we work with different, they call them ESF seats. It's a whole nother stories, but you get a lot of people in one big room and they all work together to solve this crisis that's going on and affecting the people that live in that area. But when it comes to decision making, like I said, it is very top down. You have your commander who will tell the police exactly where they should be and what they should do, so on and so forth from there. I wonder, like, what kind of efficiencies or inefficiencies lie within not having that team approach when it comes to making those decisions.
And it sounds like also, though, in involving the people locally and who have that information that the commander might not have, and at least being able to gather all of that information so that they can then make those decisions, I would guess is a pretty important part of their decision-making process. And so like, if we just make our commands without gathering information first, then it really impairs our decision-making. It's just like if we were trying to treat a patient without doing our diagnostics, we're not going to have a really great treatment plan. And we got to remember that our people are the ones providing that information.
I really love, Jasmine, that you brought up this idea of collaboration, specifically around like sort of like separate areas, right? Like you talked about Larimer County and Weld County, which butt up against each other, but they're separate counties. You could also think of those as separate veterinary practices. I think oftentimes our response in vet med is, or at least historically, it has been very insular. This is in my practice. It's my thing. I got to figure it out on my own. And sometimes those practices will adopt a collaborative approach internally, like what Cindy is talking about here, gathering that data on the ground and figuring out what is happening with people. What are they experiencing? What are they feeling? What do they need? And that can really help with that response to make it more productive. But gosh, sometimes reaching outside of your four walls can also be unbelievably helpful. I'm thinking back now to, this is reminding me of the beginning of COVID. We all remember when COVID came, at first it was like that thing you heard about in China. And then all of a sudden it's showing up in Seattle. And now it's like everything is shutting down. And I don't know about the two of you, but I felt like I was definitely squarely in that group. It's like, okay, so it's going to be a few weeks of weirdness and then everything's going to turn around. Well, it certainly was not just a few weeks of weirdness. It impacted us for a long, long time. You may recall, and there's some hard data, ABMA, VetSource got some really hard data on this. You may recall there was a period of time when vet hospitals were basically empty. Like early on, and nobody was showing up because everybody was in lockdown. We didn't know what was going on. People were terrified to leave. And there were distinct concerns from many veterinary practice owners. I'm going to go out of business. Like my doors are going to shut. And then, of course, everything went nuts after that. We saw such a spike in veterinary care visits. And then it was, well, what are we going to do? And I remember seeing there was one group online, a group of practice managers, a private Facebook group that I happened to be a part of at the time. Now, I was a part of several practice management groups at that time. Most of them went silent. There was this period of time, April-ish, maybe May of 2020, where these groups, I wasn't really seeing a lot of chatter at all. But one group in particular, practice managers got on there in the middle of this chaos and not knowing, nobody had a methodology for dealing with pet care in a lockdown pandemic, Practice managers are going on this one group and saying, hey, Cindy, you have a practice similar to ours. We don't know what to do. What are you doing? Hey, Jasmine, what are you doing? Oh, what we're doing is we're trying this curbside thing, and this is kind of how we're trying it. Oh, yeah, we're doing this curbside thing too. And actually what we've tried is this sharing, real-time sharing of experience of how they were dealing with what was a crisis. And I got to tell you, the hospitals in that group, man, they rebounded way quicker than the practices from the groups that went silent, that went insular. I think there's a ton of value in what you're saying. That don't just think about collaboration internally within your team or within your organization, but look for resources outside of your immediate. Similar practices. If you're in a corporate group, gosh, you've got a ton of resources that you can reach out to in your community, right? Or I don't know, if you're in a town like Boulder, Colorado, where there's 20 different veterinary hospitals, walk over to one of them. They're a half a mile down the road, and ask them, what are you doing? Heck, look at similar industries. What are dental offices doing? What are chiropractic offices doing? There's a lot of opportunity to get collective data from outside of your four walls.
And I think, Josh, that makes me think about how, as someone who might want to help a colleague in crisis, what might be some things to think about, some to-dos and don'ts there too. So again, anyone who hasn't received QPR training, ASK training, or something similar, which is not qualifying you to be a healthcare professional, but at least to listen for some of the concerning signs of suicidality, highly, highly recommend. I would not have guessed when I took that training how often I would use it and how empowered I would feel using it. I definitely think it has been 100% life-saving, so highly recommend. But also don't forget to, if you see somebody being cyberbullied, don't necessarily just go with what you think is the best thing to do. Ask people what they would find most helpful. Because sometimes we can inadvertently make a crisis worse by having the best intentions. So I see a lot of online groups where people will say, oh, we see somebody being cyberbullied. We're going to go and flood that page and cyberbully back, and we might inadvertently actually be getting more social media visibility to that page and escalating the crisis. So don't forget, if you have a colleague in crisis, definitely, I think it's worthwhile to help. Don't forget to reach out, ask how you might be of help, maybe give 3 easy suggestions, and don't forget that sometimes just doing the very most basic things can really help them focus on the bigger, scarier things that they have to handle. And don't fall off the face of the earth. I think a lot of times when crisis happens, we feel so nervous about saying the wrong thing that we go silent, right? And so even just saying hey, I know something's going on with you. I'm thinking about you. So if you don't even know what to offer, just still be present, I think can be really, really helpful.
Okay, so next week, 3 of us, same time, right?
Yeah, I was about to say, we are coming up on time, and I know we could talk about this and solve all the world's problems forever. So any more lasting thoughts before we schedule our next meeting?
I think I'm good.
Yeah, no, I feel like we covered a lot of ground today. I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation. Thank you both.
I'm honored to have you both here, so thank you.